Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Carmichael, member of the History Department here at Gettysburg College. I'm also the director of the Civil War Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Cecily Zander. She is a historian of the Civil War era and the American West. Cecily did her undergraduate at the University of Virginia, and there studied under Dr. Gallagher, Gary Gallagher, and as many of you know, next year at CWI we'll be featuring Dr. Gallagher's scholarship, and Cecily will be one of the faculty members as well. She ventured to Penn State, where I also did my PhD. Yeah, you did it with my fellow graduate student, Bill Blair. We did our work together there under Dr. Gallagher when he was at Penn State. You worked with Dr. Blair, and after getting your PhD, you're now an assistant professor of history at the Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas. I just asked Cecily, is it all women? And she said, no. So are they going to change the name?
No.
They're not going to change the name. All right, that makes perfect sense. Cecily's first publication, which is based on your dissertation, is entitled The Army Under Fire, Antimilitarism in the Civil War, published by LSU in 2024. She already has a contract for her second book entitled Abraham Lincoln and the American West. That's under contract with Norton. She's going to be speaking today on John Pope and the Massacre of the Sioux Indians, a bizarrely understudied topic, one that's not well known amongst Civil War historians. And I mentioned Jamie Martinez, who gave an excellent talk on Native Americans, looking at specifically North Carolina, that we've actually not given the study of Native Americans during the Civil War as much attention as it certainly deserves. I'm glad we are addressing that today, and it's wonderful to have Cecily Zander with us. Thank you, Cecily.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. I know you guys have a plethora of choices when it comes to the programs here at the Civil War Institute, so I'm really flattered that you would come out to hear me speak. I'm frankly astonished that you would come out to hear about John Pope for an hour, but we will muddle through together and do our best. I also want to thank Pete, Ashley, Jill, Triada, and the student team at the CWI, except for Colleen, who earlier this morning asked me in a very negative way if I was a millennial, and I took that personally. So if you see Colleen later, please tell her that was rude. But as you all know, they do amazing work, and I'm so grateful. They make it so easy for all of you as attendees and all of us as presenters to have such a wonderful time here in Gettysburg. So with that, I'll launch into my presentation. I'm hoping to speak for about 45 minutes or so today and leave time for plenty of questions. I feel like this is a topic that may inspire some conversation, at least I hope it will. And in that time, I want to touch on three themes that I hope will really help us shed some light on, as Pete said, this really kind of understudied issue in the Civil War era, which is John Pope and the Dakota War of 1862 and its aftermath. So my three themes today are going to be the following. I want to survey Pope's antebellum military career and his early Civil War experiences. And then we're going to look at his role in prosecuting the Dakota War in the context especially of wartime debates over the limits of violence or the embrace of total war or hard war, which has been a real theme of the conference so far. And finally, we want to consider maybe how Pope's experiences in the Dakota War influenced his postbellum career. Pope stays in the Army until 1886. He's one of the most important officers in the postbellum Army because of his experience, and he really became one of the Army's leading advocates for the fairer treatment of indigenous people in the West. And so I kind of want to look at this arc of Pope's career and see how he gets there. Now, I'm going to admit to you that I've just lied. Because I said I was going to do these three things, and now I'm going to do a fourth thing, which is give you some background on the Dakota War of 1862, because not a lot of folks really know much about that conflict. I also want to address some of the terminology I'm going to be using today. because in the kind of overlap of the fields of Civil War history, the history of the American West, and the history of the Indian Wars in particular, scholars are constantly reevaluating the language that we use to talk about these issues, and things that are readily apparent to us as 21st century Americans would not have been so apparent to people in the 19th century, and vice versa. So we want to be careful about putting into context the words that people in the past used, and then the words we ourselves use to talk about these subjects. And historians really work to chart a course between those points, and I'll also admit that the language that I choose to use today may be outdated by the time someone is watching this 5, 10, or 15 years down the road. This is a wonderful image from the 1840s, a watercolor of a Dakota medicine dance near Fort Snelling in what is present-day Minnesota. I'll show a map in just a second, but I think it's a lovely kind of image to start us off. So the Dakota War of 1862, which many white settlers at the time of the conflict called the Dakota Uprising, took place over a period of 5 weeks from August to September 1862. It involved men from 4 bands of what were known as the Eastern Dakota people, led by an Indian leader named Little Crow. He was on the first slide there across from Pope. The Dakota had been forced to cede by treaty much of their land in Minnesota and Iowa in the 1850s, and were relocated or confined to a strip of land about 20 miles in length along the Minnesota River known as the Lower Sioux Agency. I'm going to throw up a map here. I think it'll help us take a look. So this is kind of a map of the entirety of the area which the Dakota War took place. You have Minnesota fairly clearly defined there. What was at the time Dakota Territory, which is now the states of North and South Dakota. The border between the two is the Red River of the North. I'm a Texan, I have to make that clear. We have a Red River in our state as well. This one is in the north, and so we're going to be looking at this kind of region. Fort Snelling down there, which is where that watercolor was drawn, is just below St. Paul. And so this is going to be the kind of seat of the war and the theater that we're looking at. So I'm going to use terms such as Indigenous people and Native Americans today pretty interchangeably. And I'm also going to talk about the nation's Indian policy. This is a 19th century term, and while anachronistic in some ways, it serves as the best shorthand we have for delineating the broad set of ideas that really governed the relationship between Native peoples and the American state. I'm going to talk about the white civilian population of the region as immigrants or settlers. The white settlers who moved to Minnesota in the 1850s were largely native-born Americans, hailing from New York and New England, although Germans from Germany made up about 10% of the state's population in the census of 1860, a population that totaled 172,000 people. Eventually, about 26,000 of those, or 1 in 7 Minnesotans, would make their way into blue Union uniforms, serving in one of the 23 regiments of infantry, cavalry, and artillery that the state would eventually tender into federal service. But in contrast to many of their Union brethren hailing from eastern states, these Minnesota soldiers had just about as good a chance of fighting against their native neighbors as they did of facing Confederate foes. I'll use the term Dakota War to describe this intense period of fighting in the fall of 1862. And that period resulted in the deaths of about 600 white settlers over that period of about 5 weeks. Of those settlers, about 70 were soldiers, actually in federal uniforms, and about 50 more were armed civilians who had taken up weapons to help fight back against the incursion. The others were mostly unarmed civilians, young men, women, and children who were recent immigrants to the state. At the same time, an estimated 75 to 100 Dakota soldiers died during the fighting, before the trials and sentencing of the perpetrators. So many of you probably know, if you know anything about the Dakota War, you know about the famous trials that were held after the perpetrators were captured, during which 38 Dakota soldiers were hanged in what remains the largest mass execution in American history. But as many of you probably also know, about 300 Dakota men were originally sentenced to death for their participation in the war. 392 were tried in these very hasty military trials, which were held in Mankato down there, which is also where the hangings took place. Not all of them were sentenced, but 303 were. And then Abraham Lincoln personally commuted the sentences of 273 of the men. He looked over the list, went sort of page by page, and decided to look at the crimes, the sentences, and so on, and commuted those 273 men for saying that the crimes were not sort of significant enough to result in their deaths. But after the war, campaigns by John Pope, directed by Pope, result in the capture of many indigenous participants, as well as about 1,700 Dakota men, women, children, and elderly, who were removed first there to Fort Snelling, where they were held until May of 1863, at which point they were loaded onto steamships and transported to Crow Creek Reservation in present-day South Dakota. You can see there on the map, where their descendants continue to live on one of the state's 9 Indian reservations. Estimates of deaths in the camps at Fort Snelling range from about 100 to 300, mostly due to outbreaks of measles and other diseases. So a fairly familiar Civil War story in that regard. So the conflict is undoubtedly costly on both sides, and the number of civilians killed seemed to spur John Pope to issue one of the harshest statements he ever made during his Army career. So there's a lot of text there, but I'm going to read it. On September 28th, as recently federalized Minnesota volunteers set out in pursuit of Little Crow and his followers, Pope wrote the following to Henry Sibley, who was the officer in charge of the campaign on the ground. Quote, "The horrible massacres of women and children and the outrageous abuse of female prisoners still alive calls for punishment beyond human power to inflict. There will be no peace in this region by virtue of treaties and Indian faith. It is my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux if I have the power to do so, and even if it requires a campaign lasting the whole of next year. Destroy everything belonging to them and force them out to the plains, unless, as I suggest, you can capture them. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made." This is easily one of the most vicious letters I've seen written by a Civil War commander. Certainly one of the most vicious I've ever seen written by Pope. And Pope was a guy who could write a pretty angry letter. It's something that made him quite unpopular with his fellow officers. And any of you who are familiar with his headquarters in the saddle order from the Second Bull Run campaign will recognize this tendency of his. But this is, I think, on a different level. And we can try and contextualize what spurs Pope to write this letter. And now that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm actually going to launch into those 3 themes I talked about. Right, Pope arrives in Minnesota fresh from defeat at Second Bull Run, and he's facing a loyal civilian population baying for blood in Minnesota. And he acquiesces. But he would later take a very different tack when it came to talking about the Army and the West's indigenous occupants. But let's go back to Pope's early years to understand how he got there. This is Fort Snelling in the 1850s. John Pope will spend considerable time here in 1851. He was born, though, in Louisville, Kentucky in 1822, as many of you know, the son of a prominent lawyer and judge, family friend of Abraham Lincoln, when his family moves to Illinois when he's a young man. In 1838, he enters West Point at only 16 years old, quite young to be entering the military academy, graduating 17th in the class of 1842, which included fellow Civil War officers such as William Rosecrans, Alexander Stewart, Abner Doubleday, Daniel Harvey Hill, George Sykes, Lafayette McLaws, Earl Van Dorn, and James Longstreet, who, as we know, would later prove a particular bugbear to Pope when the Union officer apparently forgot about Longstreet's entire wing of the Army of Northern Virginia at Second Bull Run. And who among us can say we haven't forgotten about an entire wing of the Army of Northern Virginia from time to time? But Pope's class rank, 17th, was good enough for him to choose his branch of service, and he chose the Corps of Topographical Engineers. And apart from a brief break during the Mexican War, when he served under Zachary Taylor in many of the war's early campaigns in northern Mexico, Pope is on duty with the engineers from 1842 until the outbreak of the Civil War. He traveled first to Florida, immediately following the conclusion of the Second Seminole War, which remains the longest and costliest Indian war in the nation's history, on to Maine, where he helped survey the boundary with Canada, to Minnesota, where his job was to explore and sound the navigability of the Red River, and then eventually on to Texas, where he was engaged in helping survey potential routes for a transcontinental railroad, and in an artesian well boring project that made him quite infamous in the old Army. And we know this because the best anecdote teller in the Civil War, Edward Porter Alexander, spends considerable time mocking John Pope for his work in Texas. Pope had been sent by Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War at the time, to drill holes in the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of the western part of the state. The goal was to find water and bring it to the surface. Water can power steam engines. You can build a railroad across the South all the way to California. Pope was able to drill hundreds of feet down into the Llano Estacado, but he couldn't bring water to the surface. He didn't have the windmill technology that would eventually help Americans to settle the Great Plains. But Pope just became a kind of subject of mockery. He literally spent years and thousands of dollars of the government's money to drill wells that didn't produce any water. And Edward Porter Alexander writes of a song that featured Pope during this time that went something along the lines of Pope told a flattering tale that proved to be bravado of the streams that spout like ale on the Llano Estacado. We love Porter Alexander for that. So Pope's a bit of a subject of mockery, but it's actually his time in Minnesota that is of most concern for me, because we don't have a clear sense of why Abraham Lincoln transfers Pope to Minnesota after the Battle of Second Manassas. Nobody ever really makes this clear. Pope doesn't speculate on it in his own memoirs. But I suspect it was really Pope's familiarity with the region that made him a worthy candidate to handle the aftermath of the Dakota War, because Pope's reporting on Minnesota's potential had helped spur immigration to the territory, which became a state in 1856. His reports from 1851 featured passages where he described, quote, "the most remarkable country I have ever seen. For its singular uniformity of surface, the wonderful fertility of its soil, its peculiar fitness for the production of all kinds of grain, and the great healthiness of its climate." Or the case where he opined, quote, "it is impossible to describe the feelings of admiration and astonishment with which we first beheld this charming country in the vicinity of this place. And were I to give expression to my own feelings and opinion in reference to it, I fear they would be considered the raving of a visionary or an enthusiast." So he clearly loved Minnesota. But he had little to say about Native Americans in this reporting, even though he knew that many called the region home in the 1850s when he went there. But they were not absent, and this is really critical. So Pope spent considerable time in his reports explaining the trade in furs and pelts that still flowed north from the Red River into the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company, which controlled a vast territory in what is today central Canada. Pope complained that lack of white American settlement in the region meant that the Hudson's Bay Company could continue to exploit this trade, profit off furs that were harvested in the United States, and make money for their British corporation. He claimed that company agents actually actively worked to dissuade permanent settlement along the border with Canada, and he gave an intriguing reason for this, which involved his understanding of the differing approaches taken by British-controlled Canada and the United States to their respective Indian policies. Pope claimed that one reason the Hudson's Bay Company wanted to avoid permanent settlement in the region was that it would push out the, quote, half-breeds, as he called them, upon whom the company relied to actually supply their principal product at low cost. And what Pope meant by this was the mixed race, indigenous and white or European peoples who populated much of the region, because the British and the French before them had actually encouraged intermarriage as a way of solidifying bonds between European traders and their native suppliers, a policy that often benefited native peoples who could use their mixed status to negotiate for better prices, better trade goods, and even some degree of independence from the imperial trade networks that they supplied. American Indian policy by this point in the 19th century looked vastly different from the extractive colonialism that preceded the arrival of the Anglo-American settlers to the northern plains. Because American settlers, by contrast, were settler colonists who sought to settle and displace native people from the lands that they desired for their own use. It could be done by treaty or campaigns of forced removal, which often involved the army. These native people, once resettled, were encouraged to take up professions and lifestyles that the United States government deemed quote, civilized, namely agriculture, an anathema to the itinerant indigenous societies that peopled the Great Lakes and the Great Plains, whose cultures emphasized cyclical migrations that allowed them to maximize their access to natural resources and trading networks. And Pope had pointed out this critical difference. When native people had the freedom to live as they wished, without the influence of the American government, they remained nomads, trading furs and pelts harvested in the United States with the British traders of the Hudson's Bay Company, and intermarrying with European settlers, an act that Pope and others of his generation would have viewed as akin to the miscegenation, or intermarrying of black and white Americans, that Americans both North and South feared would result from any effort to end the institution of slavery. Pope did not question his government's policy, and he displayed no particular animosity toward Native peoples, but he was not yet the radical he would become in his thinking about military affairs during the Civil War. And that is the one thing worth underscoring before we move to the next theme. Pope believed in the vast potential of the region surrounding the Red River and the value it had for the country. And perhaps this insight, gleaned from his time as a topographical engineer, fueled the rage that permeated that letter to Sibley. But I think the letter also reflected his beliefs about combat and conflict during the Civil War, ideas that reflected Pope's early and eager embrace of hard war and the targeting of civilians and their property, which set him apart from many of his contemporaries, especially in 1862. These ideas and their implementation are key to the second theme of the talk, how Pope's early Civil War experience influenced his handling of the Dakota War and its aftermath. So there's some gentlemen you're probably familiar with, some of the both political and military minds who helped the development of a hard war policy come about, or in the top right corner, actively tried to hinder it at every possible point. But there's John Pope in the bottom corner, and he cut a unique figure among the cohort of West Point trained officers who helped lead the Union to victory, because he did not adopt the apolitical attitudes that permeated the officer corps of the old Army and were emphasized time and time again by men like George McClellan. Pope was proud to be labeled a Republican, especially in an army that seemed to be guided by conservative ideas, even democratic ones, regarding the future of slavery and the related adjunct to that, the future of the American West. Now, there remains some question about whether Pope would have identified himself as a Republican outright, or whether he merely adopted Republican attitudes to advance his Civil War career in a Democratic-dominated officer corps. We know, of course, that much of the old Army and the leadership of the Army of the Potomac under George McClellan was very Democratic, capital D Democratic, also coded as quite conservative, waging a limited war that would not put extensive pressure on the Confederacy, and indeed certainly not on Confederate civilians, to ideally coerce or make reconciliation after the conflict much easier. Neither of these answers when it comes to Pope is entirely satisfactory, and his own reminiscences really offer, again, no indication of his feelings. There's perhaps a reason why they're not one of the more often cited sources for Civil War history. He doesn't actually give a lot of insight into his own thinking. He never writes extensively about the Dakota War. They literally end at the Battle of Second Manassas. He doesn't go on to tell us about his time in Minnesota. But when Pope recalled the early years of the Civil War, he emphasized that he had always maintained a conviction that if the North and South came into conflict over slavery, the only way that the war could end would be with the destruction of that institution or with Confederate independence. And in an essay on Abraham Lincoln, Pope never even indicated that he had voted to send Lincoln to the White House, though as many of you know, he did accompany Lincoln from Illinois to the Capitol before his first inaugural address. And though Pope could be shrewd when it came to Army politics, we don't know that he had any ulterior motives to his republicanism. The most we can say is that he benefited from having a personal view of the war that placed him in opposition to prominent Democrats who had bungled the Union war effort well into the summer of 1862. Right. Pope arrives in the aftermath of McClellan's retreat on the peninsula, And he's coming in claiming that he's going to attack. He's going to show aggression. And this really gratifies people like Salmon Chase and Gideon Wells and Edwin Stanton, who are tired of McClellan and his seemingly perpetual case of the slows. Pope's going to do more for the Republicans than McClellan could ever have done. And Pope believed, above all else, that Union armies needed to place slavery in their crosshairs if they hoped to defeat the Confederacy. As David Hunter Strother, a Virginian who served as a topographer for Pope in 1862, wrote in his wartime diary, Pope was convinced, quote, the war had necessarily given the death blow to slavery. So Pope arrives here earlier and more aggressively than many of his contemporaries. And Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who's down there in the corner, nurtured high hopes for Pope. He supported him as the nation's best alternative to George McClellan, for whom, as we all know, Stanton nursed a powerful loathing, that's putting it mildly. But factors beyond the battlefield, I think, may also have endeared Stanton to Pope. Both of them suffered the intense grief of the loss of a young child in the summer of 1862. On July 8th, Stanton lost his 8-month-old son, James, and just 2 weeks later, Pope received word of the death of his 1-month-old daughter, Cara. And really, this was only 6 months after President Lincoln had laid to rest his 11-year-old son, Willie. These are men who are suffering sort of from intense grief. They're trying to navigate the conflict in addition to this kind of personal turmoil. And I think, again, we have to consider how this is affecting their thinking. Pope receives a very positive response, though, from Washington's denizens, especially the leading lights of the radical faction, amongst whom Salmon Chase, of course, stands out. And if you haven't read Chase's wonderful wartime diary of his time in the cabinet as Treasury Secretary, I highly recommend it. He contrasted the arrival of Pope with McClellan in his diary, giving an account of a dinner that Pope had shared with Chase, during which Pope condemned McClellan's campaign on the peninsula. Quote, General Pope expressed himself freely and decidedly in favor of the most rigorous measures in the prosecution of the war. He believed that in consequence of the rebellion, slavery must perish, and with him it was only a question of prudence as to the means to be employed to weaken it. He was in favor of using every instrument which could be brought to bear against the enemy. And while he did not speak in favor of a general arming of the slaves as soldiers, he advocated their use as laborers in defense of fortifications and any way in which their services could be made useful without impairing the general tone of the service. And I think what this account really underscores is Pope is ready to take action, ready to use, as Chase says, every resource available. So if we think about that letter that Pope sends to Sibley, do everything you can. Be active, be aggressive, take the initiative. This allows Pope to set himself apart from McClellan by relying on his hard war credentials. He derived many of these from his early experiences in Missouri in 1861, where he confronted staunch Confederate guerrilla fighting. In July of that year, Pope had issued an order to hold civilians accountable for the destruction of the North Missouri Railroad, which had been a critical aid to Union occupation in the border state. He wanted to punish disloyal civilians, not simply enemy combatants, for hampering Union operations, just as he would eventually do in Virginia. Again, a step McClellan had been unwilling to take. And the soldiers in Pope's army really embraced their leader's altered vision for the war, and they wanted to put Confederate civilians in their crosshairs. Remember, to this point, Union soldiers had actually been told to guard Confederate property. They were told to keep Confederate civilians out of the war. It fit within a conservative vision of the conflict, which held that the less Union soldiers did to disrupt the lives of Confederates, the easier reconciliation would be. But Pope quickly says this isn't going to work anymore. And from July 18th to 23rd, 1862, Pope signals his intent to turn the Army of Virginia, into a force of practical liberators. General Orders Number 5 dictated that Pope's troops were to live off the land and only pay loyal citizens for goods requisitioned in support of the army. General Orders Number 6 directed soldiers to require the residents of any town or village through which the Union forces passed to provide supplies to the Federals. General Orders Number 7 required that Virginians cooperate with Union troops to suppress guerrilla activity or be considered disloyal and subject to arrest. General Orders Number 11 ordered unit commanders in the Army of Virginia to arrest any disloyal male citizens within Union-occupied territory and require them to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. And General Order Number 13 denied private citizens the protection of Union troops, claiming that the energy of federal soldiers should not be wasted in protecting the property of those most hostile to the government. And these ideas start to align with the development of a subject that has come up several times throughout the conference so far, the development of what is called the Lieber Code, or General Orders Number 100, which was published in 1863, but developed through the summer and fall of 1862. The first, as you all have heard several times before, a fully fledged code of war for the American Army. Here's an image from the 1862 summer campaign of federal soldiers, what was sort of described as looting in Virginia, but simply following the general orders that Pope had issued to his army, allowing them to sort of take on activities such as this. Here is Francis Lieber. There is sort of a version, a facsimile of his code for the government of armies in the field as it became known when it was issued by the War Department. But it had been developed, as I said, throughout 1862 in consultation between Lieber and Henry Halleck on issues ranging from how to handle guerrilla fighting to how to treat prisoners of war. Absent from the Lieber Code, though, despite the Dakota War's national stature, the fact that it was occurring as they were debating these issues, really any commentary at all on how to engage with Native American combatants rather than Confederate partisans. And there you have Little Crow, the Dakota leader, who helped to organize the fight against Minnesota settlers during the Dakota War. The code said nothing about indigenous peoples, but it did govern the conduct of Union armies in the field, imposing restraints on how harshly soldiers could treat enemy civilians, and proclaiming that soldiers should not partake in, quote, any act of hostility which makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult, end quote. But this didn't really seem to apply when it came to Native Americans, and I'm going to talk about why I think this is the case. We have incidences like the Dakota War, but we also have wartime massacres of Native people, such as 250 Shoshone men, women, and children killed at Bear River, Idaho in 1863, and perhaps as many as 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho slaughtered at Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864, which affirmed that the Lincoln government did not really intend to apply the same rules of just warfare to the West Native American occupants. So Pope can get away with a message like the one he wrote to Sibley. Lieber argued for important restraints on armies in the field. For instance, officers must be held responsible for their actions, even when following orders, and armies should be prohibited from the wanton destruction of non-military resources, precisely the thing that Pope had ordered Sibley to do and would eventually order Alfred Terry and Sully to do as well when they joined campaigns against the Dakota in 1863 and 1864. Lieber's insistence that military necessity, however, might excuse the actions his code prohibited made it a sometimes frustrating and ambiguous blueprint for military behavior. And it's this phrase, military necessity, that I think Pope is going to exploit when he writes to Sibley, because his missive suggested he imbibed one of the key elements of the Lieber Code, its directive that war should be short and sharp. Quote, the more vigorously wars are prosecuted or pursued, the better it is for humanity. Sharp wars are brief, said the Lieber Code. And Pope really tried to pursue the Dakota along those lines. Make it a short, sharp war. Do what you can under the label of military necessity. Bring the Dakota to heel on the Great Plains. And if we want to give Pope some credit as a military commander, and I know we all might be very reluctant to do so, but let's use our imaginations. He beat several far more famous and highly lauded contemporaries to an embrace of these hard war ideas. These guys might be familiar. Pope's 1862 letter, after all, was not so different from the plan outlined by Ulysses Grant to Henry Halleck in 1864 regarding Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, which first directed David Hunter and then later Philip Sheridan to, quote, eat out Virginia clear and clean so that crows flying over it for the balance of the season will have to carry their provender with them. And likewise, William Tecumseh Sherman's declaration that he would, quote, make the march and make Georgia howl, end quote, does not seem quite so bloodthirsty when we consider Pope's plan for handling the aftermath of the Dakota War. But unlike Sherman and Sheridan, who returned to the West after the Civil War just as Pope did, and in many cases extended their finely honed Civil War aggression to the nation's continued fights against various indigenous groups, Sherman once said, for example, quote, I don't care about interesting myself too far in the fate of the poor devils of Indians who are doomed from the causes inherent in their nature or the natural and persistent hostility of the white race. Okay, thanks a lot, Kump. While Sheridan said that the Army could, quote, not successfully fight Indians on the principles of high-toned warfare, and said he would never spare Native women or children on principle, querying, quote, did we cease to throw shells into Vicksburg or Atlanta because women and children were there, end quote. By contrast, Pope's going to take a major step back after the Dakota War and begin to reconsider his ideas about military justice and the effectiveness of campaigns such as the one he had proposed when he took on really the aftermath of the Dakota conflict. And this brings me to my third and final theme. Because within a matter of months after his arrival in Minnesota, a matter of months after he wrote that incredibly harsh letter directing Sibley to utterly exterminate the Dakota, Pope's attitudes about Indian affairs really began to change. And I think they reflected his nuanced understanding of the military situation in the American West and a recognition in some ways of what the Lieber Code left unsaid, especially when it came to Native American peoples. Because into 1863 and 1864, Pope begins to approach the conflict against the Dakota in a dual light. He encourages his field commanders, Sibley and Sully, to employ devastatingly destructive tactics, including scorched earth campaigns, which I think were permitted under that Lieber Code umbrella, though ambiguously defined, right, military necessity, to deprive the Dakota of resources to fight against the Army. Sully will go out to what is called the Badlands of North Dakota and destroy Dakota camps. There's a Harper's Weekly woodcut. So interestingly enough, the Dakota War, these campaigns were significant enough to find their way into the pages of Harper's Weekly in the midst of the Civil War, which tells us something interesting about the ways in which Civil War Americans were trying to make sense of these two kind of conflicts occurring simultaneously, and why I think there is some reason that Lieber and others should have considered Native American warfare, not least because it's what the Army usually did. I mean, the Army's primary occupation in the 19th century is as a force that fights Native Americans, and yet that doesn't seem to inform in any clear way these stratagems, these doctrines. And I think obviously it has a lot to do with how you view your enemy. Native peoples were not viewed as human enough, I don't think, to be included in the Lieber Code. And this is what John Pope starts to fight back against. John Pope actually starts to make an argument for the humanity of Native peoples, because he saw how destructive the kind of campaigning that he had ordered had actually been to Native societies. But he demands that Sully and Sibley go out and undertake these really scorched earth campaigns in the western part of what is today North Dakota, indicating to the Dakota the overwhelming power of the federal government. But at the same time, he begins to write quite frequently about needing to provide aid and assistance for groups that he considered peaceful, the Dakota who had actually willingly returned to reservations during the campaigns. I'm not going to stand up here now as I sort of talk about this third theme and say that Pope was particularly enlightened when it came to Native American affairs. It would be hard to say that about anyone who spent their life in service of the American Army in the 19th century. But if you look at the kind of broad base of the military and their ideology, especially after the Civil War, he stands out, along with perhaps someone like George Crook, as someone who really seriously considered the consequences of the Army's actions in the West. And as Pope becomes increasingly familiar with the Indian problem, his observations of the failed functioning of national Indian policy, which, remember, as I said earlier in the talk, he had really not thought to question prior to the Civil War, convinced him that it was fundamentally ineffective. And he began to offer both criticisms and suggestions, approaching the Indian question from the viewpoint of a military commander, because you also have to understand no group of people in the United States had perhaps a better understanding of Native American affairs than Army officers. They were the people who came into contact with Native peoples far more often than anyone in the federal government making policy, any of the civilians running the Indian Bureau back in Washington, and so on. And Pope considered his job as an Army commander to be one of two parts. He needed to defeat indigenous enemies, but more importantly, he felt, ensure a lasting peace, and not one that would fundamentally damage either the culture or the chances of survival for Native peoples. Army officers, he said, were needed to maintain that peace, and while planning for the eventual assimilation of Native Americans into white society. This is why I said I'm not going to call Pope a total progressive, right? He still is a fundamental believer in civilization policy, the idea that you need to convert Native Americans from their culture, from their lifeways, to accepting white society. But in this view, Pope, like in his wartime republicanism, cuts a unique figure. And at a time when many of his fellow officers were more concerned with the extermination of the nation's indigenous people, he wanted to plan for a future for those people within the United States. And this is the irony of Pope's Civil War experience and his relationship to the hard war tactics he had once so eagerly embraced, even innovated, as I had said. By the end of the Civil War, as Pope and his fellow officers contemplated a return to their traditional service, namely Indian wars, Pope moved away from advocating for unrestrained warfare against indigenous peoples, rejecting on principle the kind of military thinking that produced slaughters of innocent natives at places such as the Washita in 1868, the Marias Massacre in Montana in 1870, where the United States slaughtered 173 Piegan Blackfeet women, children, and elderly, or the Battle of the Big Hole during the Nez Perce War of 1877, not to mention the most infamous example of the Army's violent tendencies, Wounded Knee in 1890. Pope's main complaint was that the treaty system employed by the federal government, which promised the payment of money and goods to Native peoples after a treaty was signed, was ineffective. Treaties paid, essentially, for indigenous people to respect the federal government, and Native Americans, in Pope's view, then learned to exploit this expectation. This pattern, Pope came to believe, explained the origins of the Dakota War. Annuity payments, Pope claimed, led to, quote, the very hostilities they were intended to prevent. As a result, Pope said, Native Americans were, quote, plundered and wronged on all sides. It was evident, Pope added, that whatever policy the government followed, indigenous people would be pushed aside and dispossessed, time and time again, as the white society of the United States continued to expand west. He insisted that federal Indian policy needed to recognize this fact. And under the policy of treaty-making, Pope believed little hope existed for anything but constantly recurring wars. And Pope was right. Official policies were an obvious contradiction. While treaties were made with the protection of native life and property in mind, the government encouraged settlers to move west, causing increased tensions. And in 1862, as Pope was handling the Dakota War, Congress passes the Pacific Railroad Act and the Homestead Act, legislation that all but guaranteed decades more conflict between the increasing waves of settlers and Native Americans of the West. Pope and his fellow officers dealt with the practical effects of these wartime initiatives well into the 1870s. In response, Pope sought a full-scale revision of the management of Indian affairs, which would take the creation and oversight of the nation's Indian policy out of the hands of politicians and civilian contractors and place it in total control of the War Department. Located in the vicinity of military posts, Native peoples would be placed under the eyes of the Army and dealt with firmly but fairly. They would be protected by soldiers rather than pursued by them. And then any future Indian wars needed to be short and sharp. Not, Pope emphasized, long campaigns that targeted non-combatants and destroyed Native American subsistence. As he put it, quote, to the Army officer, a state of peace with the Indians is of all things most desirable, and no man in the country, east or west, would do more to avert an Indian war. To him, war with Indians means far more than to anyone else except the actual victim. He sees its beginning in injustice and wrong to the Indian, which he has not the power to prevent. He sees the Indian gradually reach a condition of starvation, impossible of longer endurance, and thus forced to take what he can to save himself from dying of hunger, and cannot help sympathizing with him for doing so. But because he does so, the officer is ordered to use force against him. So it was not rebel armies that accounted for Pope's failure in the Civil War. In the case of reforming Indian affairs, it was all about politics. Pope's arguments for transferring the Indian Bureau to the War Department fell year after year on deaf ears, as congressmen continued to insist that civilians should administer Indian affairs, that congressional appointments should be in charge of reservations, money should continue to be embezzled from Indian agencies, and Native people suffer as a consequence. So we end here with John Pope, who retires from the Army, as I said, in 1886 and dies in 1892 at 70 years old. He never really wrote about Indian affairs in his memoirs. He's buried in St. Louis, in the cemetery adjacent to the Catholic cemetery in which William Tecumseh Sherman is buried. So we have Pope here as one of the great advocates for better treatment of indigenous people during the period following the Civil War. And I think it's his experiences in the Dakota War that make him kind of come to believe these things. And so Pope goes from one of the eagerest advocates of hard war tendencies in pursuing the Dakota War in 1862 to one of the great defenders of indigenous people by the end of his Army career. It gives us something new to consider about an officer who is often relegated to being the position of the butt of many a Civil War joke. And so I hope today you've gotten something of a new appreciation of Pope, maybe a little bit more understanding about the Dakota War of 1862 and the questions that it raised about these problems of hard war and the prosecuting and just treatment of enemies in combat. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you, everybody.